Hey everyone, welcome back to Histories of Horror. AL and I are beyond excited about our special guest today. He's the author of the Malevolent 8 series and several other acclaimed fantasy novels, which is what really drew my interest into asking him to come on. So please welcome Sebastien de Castell to Histories of Horror.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so Sebastien, can you tell us a little bit about the Malevolent 8 and what inspired you to create this series?
Yeah, so The Malevolent Eight is the sequel to a book called The Malevolent Seven, which I usually characterize as a little bit like the old Western, The Magnificent Seven, but with wizards going around blowing things up and swearing constantly. And that book really came out of a moment in time. It was February of 2020, and the pandemic was just starting to hit. And I had just finished a 6-book YA fantasy series called Spellslinger that I was delighted with. I loved working on, um, but I was finding myself in a sort of a state of, uh, worrying a little too much about what was okay and not okay online anymore. There's especially then, it still continues now, but I think it's not as vehement. But there was a lot of discussion on social media about things like, what fantasy tropes should we have and not have, and what should we say and not say, and which words are okay and not okay, all of which are completely normal, natural, and probably healthy discussions for societies to have. They just happen to be pretty terrible if you're a novelist, because as a novelist, you have to just be, writing from, a genuine creative impulse as much as possible. And then, after you've written your draft, you start to think about other concerns on a more intellectual level. But I was finding that hard to do. So I decided to write a book that was just going to be for me. Nobody else had to read it. I was going to, put in every word I wasn't supposed to use, or every trope I wasn't supposed to have in a book. And then, it would just be a kind of a palate cleanser novel for me. But strangely, my agent at the time asked to read it and then said that she loved it and wanted to try to sell it to a publisher. And I said no, because that's a terrible idea. No one's ever going to want to buy this book. And she ended up retiring. And I loved working with Heather. She was the greatest agent in the world. She put me on to the second greatest agent in the world, a guy named John Wood. And he, at a certain point, asked, I've heard about this manuscript, Malevolent 7. Can I read it? And I said, sure, but you're not going to like it. And then 3 days later, he got in touch and said, I love it. I want to sell it. And I said, well, you can try, but it's never going to happen. And it was the fastest book sale I ever actually made in my career, strangely enough. And then it went on to be this very popular fantasy novel, which kind of shocked the heck out of me. But I think I discovered something through that process that I hope is reassuring to readers and writers alike, which is that actually, for the most part, nobody's really trying to censor anybody. They just kind of want us to not, be intentionally hurtful towards people who have often been hurt in other contexts. And most novelists aren't in the business of trying to hurt people. So you can actually be quite irreverent. You can have lots of crazy swearing. You can have, 4-page long inappropriate jokes that aren't mean spirited, and you'll be fine. And so that's where the Malevolent Seven came out from. And it was also a book that taught me a little bit about what was bothering me about the world at the time, which was the feeling that we're dividing everyone into good guys and bad guys. And the definition of a bad guy is anyone who's ever done anything bad. And the definition of a good guy is someone who's never done anything bad. But that doesn't really work very well for a society, because we actually rely on people we, abhor to do the right thing a lot of the time. And if we don't expect people, even the people we don't like, to do the right thing, most of the time we're in trouble. And so Cade and his merry band of mystical sociopaths are the ones in Malevolent Seven who discover that there's that just because they think of themselves as the bad guys, and just because other people have called them the bad guys, it doesn't mean that they're not responsible for their fellow mortal beings, or non-mortal beings, as the case may be. And so because that book was so successful, and my publishers wanted a sequel, in fact, I agreed to write 2 sequels. So the Malevolent 8, that's where that book comes from. It was from that strange, very internal novelist, process of railing against the world and discovering that the world was not actually out to get me. But it ended up producing a book that I love, and Malevolent 8 has been a book I love as much or more.
That's fantastic. That's really awesome to hear.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I always think
I
it's
would think.
reassuring, because it's very easy to be kind of feel like it's very easy in this era that we live in to feel as if kind of everybody's out to get us. But I think it turns out that's not really the case. there's a lot of room for creative freedom, and in some ways, as much or more as there's really ever been.
Well, that's incredible. What was it like developing such a complex world with multiple characters and intertwined storylines?
So the way that I tend to write is very, very character centric. And so I usually start from the standpoint of a character um, who has a perspective. And so in the case of the Malevolent Seven, it really started from Cade Ombra. He's a mercenary wondurist. So a wondurist is like a type of mage that basically sells their services to the highest bidder. And his kind of perspective on the world is, it's a terrible place, endless sort of wars. It's these petty warlords who put together armies, and they hire wonderists to go blow up the castles of other petty warlords, and the cycle just continues forever. And since he and his fellow wonderists are all kind of the bad guys, it's not really their job to fix anything. And so that perspective allows me to then go, okay, I want this world to be constantly challenging my main character. And so, in a lot of ways, when we're exposed to the world of Malevolent Seven, we see a lot of things that seem like they kind of confirm Cade's beliefs. But then there's always these cracks in it. For example, he meets this young woman named Galas, who is, through various means, ends up becoming what's called a blood mage, which is a particular type of mage whose powers almost always drive them insane over time. And he feels a little bit responsible, and he suddenly has to figure out a way to his notion is, well, I'll just find her a mentor who can help her with that, and then it's not my job anymore. And over the course of the story, you keep adding to that world, adding to those cracks in that perspective of Cade's, until as you reach the end of Malevolent Seven, and I won't spoil anything for readers, um, but he comes to realize that actually his perspective doesn't work. That he if you just stand around waiting for the good guys to do the right thing, everything will fall apart. So that approach allows you to build complexity without necessarily having to, kind of almost design it in a box. I do meet lots of other authors, great authors, who like to build an entire world with the geography, the history, the magic systems, the religious notions, the currency, and everything else, all kind of in that early phase of conceiving of the book, and then go and ask, okay, well, what stories can I tell here? But for me, I'm always starting with a character with a perspective. And so the way that I get to those intricate worlds is by continuously challenging that character's perspective. So just one kind of oddball example of this is one of the mages that Cade ends up recruiting is a guy named Aridaeus. And Aridaeus is a rat mage, so a type of totemist. So totemism is one of the 12 types of magic in this world, where a mage basically gives themselves abilities related to sort of symbolic ideals of certain animals. So you might have a felonist who's has sort of weird cat abilities, but Aridaeus is a rat mage. And in every book I've ever read where there was anything like a rat mage, they would be kind of ugly and mean and cruel. And so Aridaeus is in fact the most handsome, dashing, charming, swashbuckling mage in this sort of entire world, who will constantly tell you how noble and kind rats are. And so that allows me to get all of that detail in, because I'm not trying to build it all at once. I'm trying to continuously explore the things that will challenge that one perspective. And Cade's perspective at the beginning of Malevolent Seven, in some ways, is, it was like my perspective, the perspective of a lot of other people at the beginning of the pandemic, the feeling like the world's kind of falling apart, everybody's out for themselves and things like that. And so one of the great things about being a novelist is that as you build out these very complex worlds with all these complex characters, it kind of forces you to rethink your own perspective about the world, and often in a way that, for me at least, always tends to be more compassionate than what my first kind of reactive notions would be about people and the world around me.
I mean, that's really relatable on point about the COVID situation and the way that people were behaving. And so, how has your writing style or approach evolved since you first started working on the Malevolent Eight with all of that in mind?
Well, what's interesting is the Malevolent books, for me, are a kind of active creative chaos in a way. Um, I'm not one of those writers who has a very fixed process. People always say, are you a pantser or a plotter? Like, do you write from the seat of your pants with no idea what's going to happen next, or do you write big long outlines and work from there? And I always think of myself more as a prospector. I'm out there digging for gold, and I'll go wherever I have to try to find it. And that means that every book ends up having a somewhat different process. Interestingly, the Malevolent books, just because there's a certain vein of kind of wild recklessness to them, both in how the characters behave and the nature of the adventures that they're on, but also in the kind of the mental state I need to be in when writing them, means that I kind of have to tap into a certain amount of, I mean, I think of it as chaos, but it's probably just, I would say, creative impulsiveness. So, for example, one of my favorite characters in the Malevolent Eight is a character named Temper. And Temper came about because when my agent said the publishers would like a sequel, I said, great, go get me a check. And he said, well, you have to write a book proposal first. And I absolutely hate writing book proposals. I've never enjoyed it. It's almost easier for me to write a whole novel and then try to sell that than actually have to write a book proposal. But he said I needed to. So I did. I was writing one. I told myself I'd give myself 1 hour to write a book proposal, and that was it. And halfway through writing it, I realized I need one more character for this very bizarre opening sort of treatment that I'm putting into this book proposal. And I just suddenly went, okay, well, and then there's Temper, a 7 foot tall rabbit looking creature, except he's got shorter ears and a long tail that he wraps around the neck of his enemies before punching them to death and then lapping up their blood, and went, yeah, it's a goddamn vampire kangaroo, get over it. And that's literally what I wrote in the actual pitch itself. And oddly, the publishers, 3 days after they got the pitch, wrote back and sent back a one-line email that said, you had us at vampire kangaroo. And so now I was stuck having to write a novel that had a vampire kangaroo in it. And keep in mind, these are not satirical novels. There's a lot of dark, irreverent humor, but they're pretty sincere, sometimes even sentimental. And so, I had to make this vampire kangaroo work. But sometimes as a novelist, the more you write yourself into a corner, the stronger the chapters are as you're digging your way out of that corner. So that's an example of what I mean about that kind of creative chaos that goes into those particular books. And the same is true. I have to write Malevolent 9 later this year. And I'm gearing myself up for maximum creative chaos.
So, Sebastian, your work blends dark fantasy, moral ambiguity, and action driven plots. What draws you to explore these themes in your storytelling?
I think it's just that those things, dark sort of settings and action driven plots, they're such wonderful vehicles for exploring characters and perspectives. The thing I love about being a novelist in some ways, I mean, I love fantasy for its own sake, like lots of fantasy novelists. I grew up reading all kinds of the classics and non-classics alike. And there's just sometimes escapism is a perfectly valid thing for a fantasy novel to aim to achieve. But what I really enjoy about fantasy is it's such a good vehicle for exploring the questions that you have about the world, or the anxieties that you have about the world. And because you have to channel those into a kind of a fun or dark or whatever kind of plot with action and scenes and continuity and things that readers will grab onto, it kind of forces you, rather than let's say, circling the drain of your own anxieties about the world, forces you to channel them into action in a way, even though it's fictional action. And so that's what draws me to it, is that in each of my books I really get to kind of explore something that I care about, even when I don't have the language initially to describe what it is I care about. My debut novel, Trader's Blade, which was the first in the Greatcoats Quartet, which was the series that launched my career, it's a swashbuckling fantasy. There's lots of fun and adventure in it. But it's also me exploring the notion of idealism, and what do you do when you discover that the ideals that you clung to so much in your youth don't appear to work in the world, when it looks like idealism is sort of almost been proven to be a failure. And so while one reader might read that book and think, oh yeah, this is a nice lighthearted fantasy that doesn't take itself too seriously, other readers will sort of pick up on those themes. And so that's what I love about writing in this genre, and all the different facets of the fantasy genre, which are manifold in nature. that they let you just explore these questions that you have, even when you don't know what the question is when you're starting out. And Malevolent 7, like I say, is a perfect example of that. I was starting out feeling like there's something that was bugging me about the world, and but I didn't know what it was. And I just go off to write this kind of wild and chaotic fantasy novel with these anti-heroes going around casting spells and blowing things up. And then by the end, I realized, oh, that's what it was. What was bothering me was the feeling that if we keep dividing the world up into good guys and bad guys, we're going to end up in a situation where our society just can't hold together. And I want to write about how we need people that we don't necessarily like. And sometimes the people we don't like, it turns out to be ourselves, to still feel the obligation to do the right thing, to look out for other people. So that, I think that's what it is for me.
So, were there any discoveries during your research or world building for the Malevolent Eight that genuinely surprised you?
I think I discovered I have an innate terror of Australia for some reason. I say that partly jokingly. I was on tour with a rock band in Australia many, many years ago, and I absolutely loved it. But every time you step outside the city limits, or even in the city limits, people are warning you about something that might kill you. So I sometimes say Australia is a place where everything other than the people is trying to kill you. But I think what I found that was most interesting through writing Malevolent 8 was just how everyone knows that war is kind of chaotic. And in Malevolent 8, Cade and his merry band of emotionally damaged mercenary mages are trying to prevent this massive war between two supernatural races from basically erupting on the mortal plane, because it's going to turn all of humanity into basically soldiers, toy soldiers for one side or the other. And so they're trying to sort of solve this problem of how do you stop a war before it happens. And because they are people of a somewhat violent nature, their sort of solution is, well, just kill as many of the generals as you have to until, there's no one to run a war. But of course that doesn't work. And so the more that I was sort of exploring that notion of, I have these 7 characters who are trying to stop a war, and they're trying to stop a war using all the kinds of methods that I think a lot of us think of, almost in an angry sort of fashion. We're like, why don't they just like kill off this guy, or why don't they just stop this from happening, or pass this law? And as a writer, as I'm watching Cade and the Malevolent 7 sort of fail over and over at stopping the war using those methods, you really come to realize like how dangerous it is when you get even close to a war or a civil war or anything like that, because once that engine starts revving up, it's really difficult to stop. And so even though this is kind of a pretty irreverent dark fantasy adventure tale, that's one of the things that I took away from the writing of it, is just that there are simple solutions to prevent war. There probably aren't, which doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It means we have to try twice as hard.
Many of your characters operate in shades of gray rather than clear-cut heroes or villains. How do you approach creating morally complex characters?
I generally don't try to create morally complex characters at the sort of initial stage. A good example of this is in Trader's Blade, my debut novel. There was a character that everybody hated, was meant to hate. I hated a character named Duke Gillard. And from the perspective of Falkio, he's a pretty horrible guy. He's a bit of a dictator. He engineered the dethroning and then beheading of the king. He's corrupt. He's all these terrible things. But as the series unfolds, and the more times Falkio has to come into contact with Duke Gillard, the more he started to be forced to see other aspects to him. For example, the fact that this is a guy who, really loves his son, and it would give his life to protect his son, or the fact that this is a guy who thinks that he has a better way of solving the world's problems than the one that Falkio uses. So in the Greatcoats, that was the kind of thing where I didn't try to write a morally gray character. It's just that the more that you get to know people and characters, the more innately morally gray they're going to become. And I think we sometimes see this. Just as audiences, for example, when you're watching, let's say, a TV show or a movie, and you realize there's a character who will come on the episode or the movie 3 or 4 times, but every time they're basically saying or doing the same thing. And it starts to feel very false because we know from our own experiences that the more you get to know people, the more shades of gray you're innately going to see or find in them. And so, what I more try to do is force my characters to come into closer and closer contact with one another such that they don't have a choice but to ultimately unpeel those different layers. And so, the most evil character in or the most evil person in the world, whoever one of we might individually think that person might be, whoever that is, I promise you they don't sit around going, yes, I am evil and I delight in my evilness. They have an operating theory of the universe that makes them, if not heroic, then at least no worse than anyone else. And so, as a fantasy novelist or a novelist of any sort, your job in part is to let them have their chance to explain their side of the argument, so to speak. Aaron Sorkin, the TV writer who he created The West Wing and The Newsroom and a lot of great TV series, he used to talk about letting the villain give their speech to St. Peter as to why they should be allowed into heaven, which I always thought was an interesting way of doing it. For example, in the film A Few Good Men, that Tom Cruise movie from a million years ago, Jack Nicholson at the end gives this lengthy speech where he's justifying all these things he's done that for the whole movie we have felt were horrible things for someone to do. But he makes the argument almost as if he's arguing for why he should be allowed into heaven about why what he did was right. And so I think that's for me how you get to the morally complex characters, or characters that we think of as having shades of gray, is just keep peeling back the layers of the things they're doing, and eventually we all find ourselves in that somewhat gray soup.
I agree with that. So, fantasy often involves balancing imagination with rules that make the world feel real. How do you maintain that balance in your writing?
So I will always try to make the physical laws of that world make sense. So, for example, in the case of Malevolent 7, the sort of the entire magic system, and there's basically 12 different magic systems at play in that world, but they all work on the same underlying principle of physics, which is that there's these other different physical planes of reality where the laws of physics are different. And some people have an attunement to them such that they can cause a momentary breach between the mortal plane and that other plane of reality. And for example, Corrigan, who is a tempestoral mage, so he is attuned to the tempestoral plane of existence, where everything is these crazy storms and all this sort of electrical and energetic disruptions and all this kind of chaos. And so when he causes a breach between the two realms, that's where the thunder or lightning or fire or whatever kind of energetic force that he's channeling, that's where it's coming from. Similarly, there's a type of magic in this world called fortunal magic. And the fortunal realm is one where the laws of cause and effect aren't the same as they are in our realm. In other words, you can actually affect probability. And so when a fortunal mage, or what's sometimes called a chancer, when they are casting a spell, what they're really doing is causing a momentary breach between the mortal realm and the fortunal plane of existence, such that those laws of physics momentarily leak out. And so, and there's actual reasons to think that don't necessarily have predefined laws. It gets kind of very strange and esoteric. And I'm by no means a scientist, but I remember listening to a scientist talk about this notion of that there was a time in our universe before the Big Bang when there weren't even laws of physics in place, that something had to happen for those laws to exist. And I just thought that was such a fascinating notion. So I wanted to bring that there. But that's only one part of the process of creating, let's say, a sense of authenticity or verisimilitude. That might be a better way of looking at it, the sense of something being real, whether it's real or not. The more important part for me is often that you want the cultural context in which your characters are operating. You want that to feel realistic and authentic. You shouldn't have, if you've got, for example, a society with a king or a queen, right? You have a monarchy. Well, you can't have a monarchy without a bunch of things propping that up, because innately people don't just naturally go, why, yes, we should have a king and the king should be all powerful and they should be able to do whatever they want and we should all do whatever they say. There are usually systems in place to make that work. So, for example, even religion in the Middle Ages in Europe served a very strong function first for propping up the notion of kingship by having priests all over various parts of Europe who would say, oh, no, the king is divinely sanctioned by God, right? But then later plays a role in undermining the monarchy when the monarchy stops playing nice with various religious orders by suddenly questioning whether God actually divinely sanctions that king's rule. And so you need those interconnected pieces that make something feel solid and realistic. So, for example, in the world of Spellslinger, which is a 6-book YA fantasy series, there's lots of different magic and things like that. But as important as the magic is the sense that these cultures are operating and interacting with one another in ways that make sense. So that's usually what I'm aiming for first and foremost. And at the most base layer, the characters themselves, regardless of whether they are humans with no powers or mages with tons of power or gods even, that they are behaving in ways that internally make sense. That's one of the reasons why in the Malevolent 7, in that series, for example, people who have magical abilities are not entirely mentally stable. When you have the ability to channel bolts of lightning that can blow someone up anytime you're in a disagreement with them, blowing people up starts to look like the solution to a whole bunch of different problems. And so that affects people, right? I sometimes refer to what I think of as billionaire's disease, which is, why is it that people who are extremely intelligent, hardworking, and often seem altruistic, after they become billionaires, start suddenly behaving almost like petulant 5-year-olds determined to see what happens when you blow the world up. And so I think that those are the elements of authenticity that I'm usually reaching for when I'm writing a novel.
Of all the characters in the Malevolent 8, which one has resonated with you the most or surprised you in how they developed?
That's a good question. So in the Malevolent 8, I think oddly for me, it was Cade. And Cade is the main character in Malevolent 7 and Malevolent 8 and the narrator. And for me, that's usually the character that will surprise me the least because it's the character I think I know the best. But in the Malevolent 8, Cade, because he ends up faced with some very impossible situations, starts having to make choices that are very different from the choices that I would make. And so I found writing those scenes where he is kind of taking almost a leap of faith really surprised me, and in the best possible way. I mean, one of the most fun things, as we all know as writers, is when your characters are surprising you. And so that was what surprised me, was just how Cade goes about solving the unsolvable problems in the final act of Malevolent 8. So I really enjoyed that. And it reminded me that as I set forth into writing Malevolent 9, that I have to sort of prepare myself for the fact that whatever my intentions are for that book, the characters may decide to take it in a very different direction.
So, do you see connections between your earlier works and the storytelling you've done in the Malevolent 8?
That's a really good question. I usually find that as I'm writing, the thing that I'm most conscious of is trying to avoid kind of character spillover. So, for example, because my first 4 novels were all about a guy named Falcio Valmont, who's this very idealistic person who wanted to be what was called a great coat, which are these traveling sword fighting magistrates who would sometimes have to duel in order to enforce their verdicts, in this sort of hopeless bid to bring law and order and a sense of fairness and justice to this very troubled country. You start to get to know that character so intimately that their responses to situations are almost like a kind of an echo that you hear in your head. And so when I'm writing something like the Malevolent books, where it's also first person narration, it's also a very, very close point of view, but now we're in Cade Ombra's point of view, I'm mostly trying to make sure that I'm letting Cade be himself and not be, another version of Falcio. And I found that when I was writing the Spellslinger books as well, because again, first person character, but Kellen is very different from Falcio. And so I had to really kind of really make sure that I didn't ever let myself slide into what you might think of, or what I might think of as my comfortable Falcio shoes. So that's the thing that I noticed in terms of, it's less about my other writing informing a new book, because a new book is a new set of characters, a new set of problems. It's making sure I don't slide back into those comfortable characters that I know how to write so well, as opposed to doing the harder work of exploring these new characters.
How do you hope readers respond to your books, both emotionally and in terms of engagement with the story?
It's interesting. I used to say that I want my readers, or my hope is that my readers will laugh, cry, and cheer. Making people laugh is not that hard. I mean, I would never make it as a stand-up comedian, but in a novel, you have lots of ways of making things funny in places. Making people cry is harder because you have to make them really care about the characters and find ways to make the emotions feel really sincere, but that's also doable. Getting readers to want to stand up and cheer, that's really difficult. And so that's usually what I'm thinking, as I'm approaching the subsequent drafts of a book, when I'm trying to ask myself with each chapter, is this the best version of this chapter that I can possibly write? Is, am I taking the reader on a genuine emotional journey, or am I just, throwing in the fantasy stuff here and there? Because as a reader myself, I find it really difficult if I'm reading a book that starts to feel like it's really just about being a fantasy novel and it's not actually kind of digging into what it means to just be a human being enough. So if I'm not having an emotional response to a scene or chapter, then I worry that a reader won't. And so that's what will make me go back over and over and over, because that's the best part of it. And I'm really lucky. I've been able to be really successful, in the sense of I've had 17 novels published. I make a great living. I get to travel the world and meet readers. And when I meet readers and something that I've written has kind of helped them through a tough time, or had a really powerful and hopefully positive emotional effect on them, that's such a rewarding experience that's usually what I'm hoping for. But it's not something that you can force either. So sometimes as a novelist, you have to retreat to that first and simplest of all axioms: write the book you most want to read.
That is some age old advice for a reason. Writing high stakes fantasy can be intense. Do you find crafting dark, action packed fiction more challenging than exploring character driven moments?
No, in some ways, the sort of high octane action scenes and battle scenes and duels are easier to write. Unfortunately, they're easy to get wrong too. It's easy for them to feel functional. Sometimes a scene or a chapter can feel functional. Like you ask someone to read it and they'll say, "Oh yeah, yeah, that chapter works." But it's not really doing anything at an emotional level or even at a thematic level. When you're writing more character driven scenes, on the surface, they're harder because you don't have that veneer of action or spells being hurled back and forth to kind of carry it forward. But it also makes it easier to tell when it's working and when it's not working. You really are aware if you've written a sort of a more quiet, character centric scene that is merely functional. So in that sense, I don't really find one or the other easier to write. They both require me to constantly be asking the question, am I saying something that feels honest and true, even inside all of the kind of wrappings of mages and warriors and swords and spells and all of that that's going on around it.
Looking back at your career, what do you think has stayed consistent in your story?
If I understood correctly, the questions about what has stayed consistent in my writing across my career. I think what stayed consistent across my career is that my characters are always really struggling with what is the right thing to do, as much as it can be involve having to solve this problem or defeat this opponent or find this thing or discover the truth about something. They are constantly wrestling with the notion of, am I actually doing the right thing or not? And I always know that I've gotten the story right when I feel like a reader, right up until the very end, could almost agree with the villain that maybe the main character, or maybe my hero, is wrong. Maybe they're naive. Maybe they're just anachronistic in that way. That is one of the things I always love about swashbuckling novels and films, is that the characters are almost fundamentally anachronistic. Everyone's always telling them that their ideals are antiquated and don't apply in a modern world. And so if I if I feel like that moral quandary or that sense of, am I doing the right thing, is tenuous right up until the end, then I know, then I think I'm on the right track. And so that's probably one of the most consistent things about my novels. There's other elements too. I really enjoy writing about friendship as a kind of a redeeming force, and found families, and I love witty banter, and I love sort of fast paced, sort of sharp exchanges and things like that. But that sense of the main character always questioning or having reason to question if they're doing the right thing or not. That's probably been the most consistent element of my writing across my career.
So, what advice would you give to writers who want to explore fantasy, particularly with morally complex characters and high stakes worlds?
Well, going back to that earlier point about, writing the book you most want to read, the advice I usually give to people who tell me they want to write fantasy is write the book you most want to read as boldly as you possibly can. I think the biggest mistake that I see writers making when they're starting out is that they'll try very, very hard to be unique, or to not write something that's cliche, or to not be perceived as being too much like someone else. Because that kind of shackle of worrying about whether you're original enough, or worrying about whether the market thinks that this thing that you love is passe, that's really antithetical to the most important part of the writing process, which is digging deep and letting your experiences, your thoughts, your sense of the world, your sense of yourself come out through the lens of a story. So, for example, if someone loves Twilight, and I'm not a natural audience for the Twilight books, and it's not my sort of thing, but if someone loves Twilight, they love sparkly vampires, and they just desperately want to write about sparkly vampires, that are beautiful and seductive, and even though they drink blood and sometimes kill people, there's still something noble about them. If that's what they love, that's what they need to write. And it will come out feeling like them and feeling unique if they lean into it as hard as they can. If, on the other hand, someone says to themselves, I really love sparkly vampires and I like them to be seductive and mysterious, but also kind of noble. Oh, but I keep hearing that, Twilight's out of date, or that it's problematic, or things like that. You'll end up writing this kind of really tasteless, or sort of dull, bland gruel, so to speak, that won't resonate with anybody, because it's not actually the thing that resonates with you as the writer. So when I wrote Traitor's Blade, I was really passionate about swashbuckling tales and swashbuckling fantasy. And, I'm a big fan of The Princess Bride and the books of, Raphael Sabatini, who wrote Scaramouche and things like that. And I just went crazy with swashbuckling fantasy. I threw in every idea I ever had for a cool sword fight into that book. And if I'd been more restrained, I think I would have written a book that nobody would have really appreciated, instead of the book that ended up getting me, launching my career and giving me this really, really wonderful life as a fantasy novelist. So that's really my advice to writers is write the book you most want to read as boldly as you possibly can, never worrying about whether it's hip or cool, or whether the market likes it these days, or whether someone's going to tell you it's not original enough. Everybody I know that writes what they love, no matter how much it may seem hackneyed or cliche to me or anyone else, they always seem to succeed, and often succeed far better than people who are trying to be, really elevated and sophisticated.
Agree with that full heartedly. So, Sebastian, can you tell us what you're working on next?
I can. I'm so delighted to say, first of all, that I have finally finished Our Lady of Blades, which is a book I have spent 7 years on. I've literally had 8 books published while writing this one book. I don't know why, but this book has been my absolute bugbear for years, as I kind of struggled to, find the craft and expertise inside myself to write the story that I really wanted to write. And so now that that's finally delivered, I'm off to Tunisia for a couple of weeks with my wife. And then as soon as I get back, I will be on Malevolent 9, where I'll be returning to that state of creative chaos and exploring what Cade and his and his misfit band of wonderists can get up to next.
I agree with all of that, and it sounds like you got some really exciting works in the pipeline. Sebastien, this has been incredible. Thank you for sharing your journey and your work with us. To everyone listening, make sure you check out the Malevolent 8 series and all of Sebastien de Castell's other fantasy novels. I'm sure you're not going to want to miss these.
Thank you both so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank
All
you for
right, well, I
coming.
appreciate
We really had a lot of fun with you.
definitely
Thanks
for
so
sure.
much, Ale.
To everyone else, I hope you guys have a rest of this Sunday wonderfully enjoyed, and we will talk to you guys again soon on the next episode of Histories of Horror.
Thanks again.
Thank you.